Welcome everyone to Close Reading Poetry. This is a new playlist for questions and answers, so I'm finally getting around to some of the questions that were asked when I sent out that form when we reached 30,000 subscribers. Thank you all, by the way. And one of the questions I've gotten repeatedly is, what do you think about Bloom? Why do you disagree with Bloom? Who do you think you are to criticize Harold Bloom? So I thought I'd address that in this first video. Let's just rip off the band-aid, shall we? This all started in my Harvard video from the 1983 list, when I listed this as an anthology that one could read if one was interested in commentary on poetry. I would not recommend this book to a new reader. I would not recommend this anthology, because it's more than an anthology, to high school students or college graduates or anyone who's reading poetry for the first time. This is usually where people go, because this is widely found in Barnes & Noble and Books A Million here in the United States. It's very accessible. The reason why I don't recommend it is because it comes with commentary before the poems. And so before readers are even encountering Poe or Elizabeth Barrett Browning, for instance, they're met with criticisms like, Poe is a terrible poet, or Elizabeth Browning receives a bunch of hype simply because of the feminist critics during the 1980s and 90s, which is not true, by the way. Bloom has a particular kind of poetry that he values. He's an excellent critic. He is a master among critics. But like every critic, there are certain things that certain critics look for in poems. Bloom likes the complex, the paradoxical, the occult and mysterious. And the poets who don't live up to that criteria are the ones who are usually dismissed. Setting aside whether Edgar Allan Poe really is a good poet or not, imagine a high school reader who has just been introduced to The Raven in class. He or she falls in love with this poem. The Raven's a great, accessible poem. It's beautiful, it's musical, its meaning is not shrouded in complex language. Its meaning is apparent. And so a lot of people come to love poetry through reading poems like The Raven. Now imagine this person says, I want to read more poetry, goes to the bookstore, picks up this book, and is immediately chided by Harold Bloom's commentary on the poems. I am all about the first innocent encounter with a work of art, whether it's poetry, whether it's painting, whatever. What I am against is critical comments on a poem before one reads it. And I mentioned this in my videos when I analyze poems. I make a distinction between the pure, innocent encounter with the text and the intellectual, analytical engagement with it that I do in most of my videos. And I make it clear that I hope that the viewers who come to these explanations have read the poems for themselves before coming to it, because I think there's a big difference between criticism and the imaginative surrender and encounter with literature. And I think Bloom's commentary gets in the way of that. Okay, so that's what I think about this book, but what do I think about Harold Bloom? For those of you who are interested, I'll tell you. I have great admiration for Bloom, especially early Bloom. I think there's a big difference in the way that Bloom approaches literature as he did in the 60s and 70s than as he did in his late life. He's an excellent critic. He's insightful. He has this wonderful knack. I think one of the best things about Bloom is his ability to locate a poet within a certain tradition, which just illuminates and casts new light upon the poet. He has, in this book, I love the essay on Spenser. It's the longest essay in here. I think it's fantastic. And he has this great, I think it's his phrase for Spenser's tradition, the visionary left wing of the Protestant movement. That's where he locates Edmund Spenser. And just that phrase, really, you can really see how a number of poets fit into that. Sir Philip Sidney, for example, Milton, in a way, some of the meditative poets who came after, like Edward Young, William Wordsworth. At a time when most critics were reading Marianne Moore within the tradition of Whitman and Dickinson and the 19th century American literary movement, he said, no, she's actually not in the tradition of Dickinson and Whitman, but actually in the tradition of Stephen Crane. And I think just that comment alone resets Moore's poetry in a new light, and he had such a wonderful knack for doing that. I study Romanticism, that's my specialty. As a romantic, specialist. I have great gratitude for Harold Bloom and what he did in the 60s and 70s and 80s in his studies of Romanticism. Romanticism in the mid-20th century was looked down upon by the new critical movement. Romantic poets, their poetry did not lend itself to the new critical methods and the values of the new critics. Harold Bloom, along with his mentors Northrop Frye and M.H. Abrams, really rescued the Romantics from this critical neglect and even critical scorn by the new critics, some new critics, I should say. He also expanded the vocabulary for discussing spiritual movements within Romanticism, something that new criticism was not really able to do. M.H. Abrams, with his natural supernaturalism, really provided a way for looking at the spiritual and religious dimensions of Wordsworth, of Shelley, of Keats, and of many others. And Bloom certainly does that in his The Visionary Company beautifully. And so I have great appreciation for somebody who is both interested in Romanticism and the intersections of religion and literature. I think Bloom really paved the way for a lot of scholars to come and do the same thing, including myself. So I have great admiration for him there. The one thing I wish he did more of was close reading. Harold Bloom is not really a close reader, and I'm the kind of reader of criticism that really relishes close reading, as you all know. That's not really something Harold Bloom does. Harold Bloom often pontificates his critical judgments of the text without giving supporting evidence. He's like Samuel Johnson in that respect. This leads me to something that I do appreciate about Bloom, is that he did write for the public reader, in his later life especially. However, he also talks down to the public reader a lot, mainly by propounding these critical judgments which have this great authorial weight to them, and then asking the reader to take it for granted that this is just fact, this is just true, that Edgar Allan Poe is a terrible poet, or that Elizabeth Barrett Browning is not as good as Robert Browning. Well, Robert Browning and Elizabeth Browning are doing different things in their poems, and I think that should be taken into consideration when comparing the two. But he won't go into the details often. And that's something that I find lacking. To each his or her own. The other thing is this. I don't have much to criticize Harold Bloom. Plus, I'm a young graduate student. However, people who have read other critics will no doubt detect a certain pretension in Bloom's writings, that he often will cast himself into the sole solitary figure of the literary prophet crying out alone in the desert, while all the other literary critics in the institutions are bowing the knee to Baal. And that's just simply not true. This is something that Bloom adopts in his later years. You hear him in interviews talking about the school of resentment, which is his term for the overindulgence in ideology and theory that has infected the American Academy of Literary Criticism for the past 30 years. I'm with him on that, largely. I don't dismiss theory, I don't dismiss some forms of ideology, but he's right in some instances that in many English departments I know of or have been in, there is a lack of literary pluralism, and there's this reigning critical orthodoxy which insists that you must critique the text by politically or eco-critically or sexually or by historicizing or genderizing and or Marxicizing. You get the point. And some of these approaches can be very helpful. I think as a humanist, literature, I have to say that literature touches every aspect of human life. And so every aspect of human life is fair game to place in conversation with literature. However, the Academy has overvalued this critique. The winds of change are blowing with movements like post-critique and new criticism or new formalism and other kinds of movements that are thinking about new ways that the English Academy could study literature. Bloom was really against that. It makes a lot of sense that Bloom was against the theorists and the ideologues, I should say. I think there are many good critics who did not bow the knee to ideology and theory. You have Christopher Ricks, Helen Vindler? What about I.A. Richards or T.S. Eliot of the early 20th century, or F.R. Leavis, C.S. Lewis, Helen Gardner? There are so many other critics who were against this ideology, and I find that posturing in his later interviews to be a little disingenuous and unfair to other critics who are doing good work like him. I'm having to say all this, I think, because I learned something that I didn't know, that on the internet there's like a cult of Bloom bros, I guess you can call them. Guys, mostly, who have only read Bloom, it seems, and who have this almost like literary idolatry of Bloom. I guess he's easy to idolize, really. I mean, he's great and prolific, but there is something very masculine about this interest in Bloom on Reddit and even some places on YouTube, where it's just sweeping, grandiose, general statements on the greatness of literature without real reverent attention as to how that literature is great, and a general scorn sometimes for critics who are not Bloom. And there are other critics, so other critics who are worth, I think, reading, in addition to Bloom. The other thing I'll say is that people who read Bloom, or who are going to read Bloom, need to be aware that his idea of the canon when he was younger is different from his idea of the canon when he is older. When he's older, he'll say that the canon is something that you recognize immediately when you read it. And when he in The Anxiety of Influence, it seemed more to be the formation through a complex struggle of agon and ego and the poet's trying to be better than the other poet, and the burden of influence and of the predecessors, and this Freudian anxiety against them. That's one way to look at the canon. That's not really how I see it. I can see that working out in some poets like Milton, who is through and through a polemicist. But I don't really see that working through with other poets. I see other poets responding to their predecessors in gratitude, in appreciation. My aesthetic principle in canon formation, I guess you could say, aesthetic principle is Shakespeare's from Sonnet 1. From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. But as the riper should by time decease, his tender air might bear his memory. Beauty begets beauty. With each generation, there is this pushing forward of new forms and new utterances of beautiful language, beautiful poetry. I see it unfolding in an organic way, not in this agonistic struggle. So I hope that clarifies where I stand on Bloom. Again, really admire him. I don't take everything he says hook, line, and sinker, and I don't think you should either. And I hope that gives you an idea of what I think about the canon too, because that was another question that came up that I might address in a future video. So to sum everything up, I think that a good reader of criticism should be like a good bee. She should gather her nectar from more than one bloom. Read many critics. Read critics from different time periods, not just recent critics. And I think you'll get a sense, I think that this will enlarge your appreciation for Bloom and what he's doing, and it will also give you new perspectives of looking at literature outside of Bloom's way of looking at it. So thanks everyone for watching, thanks for the interest, thanks for the question. I look forward to addressing some of your other questions soon, and until next time.